they broke up the concrete on the southwest end, and they discovered 2 bodies there that were wrapped in plastic and buried under 16 to 18 inches of concrete.
And it's not easy to say which sample came from the last client who murdered you.
How chilling are the details of this case?
I can assure you that anyone who worked on this case has been haunted by it.
Prison, a place for society's most cunning, manipulative, and evil lawbreakers. On occasion, those guilty of the most heinous crimes are rehabilitated and see the errors of their ways. They then can end up in parole and the chance to live a peaceful life, and maybe even give something back to society. But sometimes being back in the outside world can take a sinister turn, and those who have killed will end up killing again. Today, we look at the case of David Maust, who served time for a murder in 1974, and despite begging not to be paroled, he was released back into civilization. But this killer didn't just strike again. He was sent back to prison and released a second and third time before finally being brought to justice once and for all. Next, we have Jack Unterweger, who was released after serving time for murder in 1974. His bloodlust not satisfied, he took his crimes internationally and became a wanted man across the world. And finally, the case of John Miller, who brutally murdered a child and would evade justice for over 30 years before he was snared by his own stupidity. So let's dive right into the cases of dangerous killers who got released from prison. Born April 5th, 1954, David Maust had a troubled life from an early age. He was sent to live between his mother and father, Eva and George. He was never given the chance to settle, and before long, his mother had him institutionalized at the Chicago State Hospital. It has been reported that his parents just didn't want him around, and it's believed they were both victims of abuse from an early age and had also been mistreated by their parents.
Back then, mental hospitals were kind of used as dumping grounds for unwanted kids. It's very strange, very sad.
He would spend the next 4 years of his life in that hospital.
The doctors made it pretty clear that he was being kept there hoping his mentally ill mother would recover well enough that they could reunite him.
Eventually, in 1971, he returned to live with his mother. It was while living there that his mother suggested he joined the army. Bearing in mind, at this point, the Vietnam War was raging, which kind of shows how she really felt about her son, who was only 17 at the time. He joined and was stationed in Germany in 1974. While there, this troubled young man began to explore himself and his darkest, deepest desires. This would be the start of Maust's reign of terror, one that could have been prevented all along.
He was planning on killing the guy. He was thinking of killing the guy. And all of a sudden, he just stopped for no apparent reason.
13-year-old Jimmy McClister befriended the much older Maust at a bowling alley. Although it's unclear exactly how events transpired, Maust does claim he woke in his room to find young Jimmy undressed and in bed with him. The next month, the pair took a motorcycle ride into the woodlands, and it was here that Maust pulled a knife on the terrified boy and forced him further into the foliage. Jimmy McClister was tied to a tree, and a terrifying ordeal would begin. Maust beat him, first with his fists and then with a wooden board. Jimmy did not survive the attack. It took a month for his body to be found, and before long, Maust was in custody and charged with murder. This would mark his first stay behind bars, where he would serve 3 years. The reason for his light sentence? No witnesses. The prosecution had to pursue a manslaughter charge instead of murder. Maust had claimed Jimmy died after an accident on his motorcycle. Even though it's unlikely anyone actually believed his story, he still got away with a manslaughter charge. On his release, Maust had the opportunity to set his life on the right track and find his place in society once and for all, if he could keep his deadly temper under control.
But eventually the urge would come back and he'd give in and he'd do it all over again. It was a very strange pattern.
Instead of learning from his mistakes, he just made them all over again. and by 1980 he was back on trial. While at his Chicago apartment, he stabbed a friend and was arrested on attempted murder. Maust confessed and then told an entirely different story during the trial, where he told the court his confession was a lie. Shockingly, he was found not guilty and would return to normal life once again. This time, he had revenge on his mind. It is reported that during his stay at the Chicago State Hospital that he had become involved with another boy. Maust would later claim he found it difficult to live with what he had done and decided he needed the boy out of the picture altogether.
Someone else he really was planning on killing, and he couldn't locate him or lure him or bait him or whatever. It didn't work out, in other words. So Donald Jones happened to be around and available.
15-year-old Donald Jones was persuaded to take a ride with Maust, a journey he would never return from. Maust had kept a diary for many years. In this diary, he frequently talks about his murders, his urges, and his feelings. He did the same with the murder of Donald Jones, in every sickening detail. After stabbing Jones, he wrote, "I can still hear Donald Jones saying to me, 'I'm only 15 years old. Please don't kill me.'" He then drowned the boy in an ordeal so shocking that it is almost impossible to imagine. In an effort to evade justice, Maust fled to Texas. But his lust for violence led him to stab yet another boy, a 14-year-old this time. Luckily, his latest victim would survive the barbaric attack. Maust was caught and charged with causing bodily injury to a child, for which he got a 5-year sentence. One of his diary entries spoke about the crime, and his words are chilling. "When I got locked up in the army, and then especially when I got locked up in 1981, I knew I should never be let out again. I didn't know how to act around other people, and I was never taught how to make friends and keep them. When an inmate says he doesn't want out, I hope that somebody listens." Maust himself had asked not to be released from prison, and it was discovered he was the main suspect in the murder of Donald Jones, and he was extricated from Texas to Illinois, where the authorities wanted him to stand trial. But this case would not be so straightforward. Maust would be declared unfit to stand trial and would escape justice, or at least for now, as the next decade of his life would be spent between prisons and several different medical facilities. But by 1994, 12 years after his incarceration, he confessed to the murder of Donald Jones and would be sentenced to 35 years behind bars. The judge gave credit for the 12 years already served, and most surprisingly, he was rewarded for his good behavior by being released early in 1999. It's difficult to understand how a man who had killed again and again after his latest release was allowed back into society without serving his full sentence. The prosecutor fought to keep Maust in prison, and even Maust himself wrote a 5-page letter to the Illinois Department of Corrections, practically begging to be kept locked up. In the end, it was a futile battle. These actions would end up having grave consequences and would leave this killer free to strike again at any time. Not long after his release, he once again returned to his old ways. He would face another attempted murder charge after beating his friend, Anthony Majzer, over the head with an iron bar. But it seems escaping justice is all too familiar, and this time the victim decided not to press charges. It isn't known why he did this, but it meant Maust, with a rap sheet, including multiple murders and attempted murders, was once again a free man. He settled in Hammond, Indiana, and found work in a local business called Trophies R Us. And it was around this time that one resident of the town mysteriously disappeared. Nick James was only 19 years old when he was last seen on May 2nd, 2003. More disturbingly, he also worked at Trophies R Us. And it only got worse from there. In the same year, 2 other young men were reported missing, 13-year-old Michael Dennis and 16-year-old James Renagi. Dennis and Regani were friends and had visited Maust in his second-floor apartment. There, he is reported to have supplied them with alcohol and narcotics, according to the boys' friends. Both were last seen September 10th.
When they disappeared, it was like, well, they'll surface at some point, or who knows where they ran out to, or, maybe they're just runaways and they'll come back kind of thing. But if I remember right, one of the 3 was not that kind at all, okay? And so either his family or his friends, I forget, I think his family, were pushing the police. And
Suspicion soon fell on Maust as police dug deeper, and they discovered his horrifying secret.
they run Maust's record, and sure enough, he's got a history of killing two teenage boys, okay? So that perked their interest, and then they began circling around him.
Police obtained a search warrant and began a search of his house. They would find nothing incriminating inside until they moved into the basement and made a gruesome discovery.
And they discovered two bodies there that were wrapped in plastic and buried under 16 to 18 inches of concrete. They then went to the west end, or the north end of the west wall, where the dog had made the second alert on the different hole, and they broke that one up, and they discovered the third body.
Maust would stand trial for his most sickening murders to date. This time he was facing the rest of his natural life behind bars, as he was given 3 consecutive life sentences. Just as he had many times in the past, Maust found a way to evade justice one last time. On January 19, 2006, only months after his conviction, David Maust was found hanging in his cell. He died the next morning. His suicide note would reveal his final moments of inner torment as he told the world, "There is a long line of people who would like to see me die, but the families have a right to be in the line first, then my mother, then the taxpayer. Dying is not my first choice, but it is the right thing to do." Throughout his life, this sick and twisted maniac was able to commit some of the most barbaric acts on his victims, and then find himself free to do it all over again. The world will sleep a little easier knowing that he will never strike again. But this killer's nationwide reign of terror was nothing compared to our next case, where we find a celebrity holding a dark past and a taste for blood.
She said she was going out to meet a wine dealer. Normally she would phone the house every 2 or 3 hours, but then she didn't call anymore.
This is the face of Jack Unterweger, celebrity, writer, and poet. He would embark on a campaign of terror against female escorts that lasted 3 decades, spanned 2 continents, and would end up labeling him as Austria's first ever serial killer.
And when I overlaid Jack Unterweger's timeline on the timeline of the crimes, they fit perfectly.
Unterweger had experienced a troubled childhood when he faced a barrage of abuse from his alcoholic grandfather. He soon found himself in and out of prison for various assaults, all against female escorts. Before long, his lust for violence turned deadly, and in 1974, he claimed the life of his first victim, 18-year-old German Margaret Schaefer. She was killed in the most terrifying way as Unterweger strangled her with her own underwear. There have been connections made to his choice of victim and his troubled childhood. He was not a planned child, and it is thought that his father was a soldier and his mother was an escort, which would end up being the same profession as all of his victims. For the murder of Schaefer, he would receive a life sentence. While incarcerated, he decided to begin studying, and from that moment, his life would change forever. From his cell, he became a published author, and a successful one at that. His works became popular in Austria. In fact, he was becoming so well known that he even gave televised readings of his own children's books while still in prison. Austria saw this former killer as rehabilitated, and he'd done it through the expression of art. This resonated with Austrian culture at the time. He became a fully fledged celebrity, and many argued for his freedom, citing his successful rehabilitation as the reason. 15 years into his sentence at 39 years old, he was released and set free to enjoy his newfound status in the world of literature. But before long, he would return to his old ways.
And what was outstanding for us, that exactly at any time where Jack hang out at any place in Prague, in the western part of Austria, in the southern part of Austria, exactly in that time period, there was always a dead body somewhere in the woods.
Unterweger lapped up the new attention and played on the poster boy image the nation had given him. Underneath the surface, he still had the same dark desires. On September 15, 1990, and the body of Blanka Bakova was found in the banks of the Vitla River, Czechoslovakia. She had worked as an escort, and the cause of death was strangulation. Tied around the girl's neck was her own underwear. This heartbreaking discovery would only be the start of things to come. Police made a connection between the two murders where the girls were killed the same way, but there was never any thought that they may be dealing with a serial killer. That would soon change as the bodies of more girls, all escorts, began turning up in the woodlands of Austria. Having no experience with such a monster like Unterweger, the Austrian police struggled with the information and resources they had, so they reached out for help and began an international investigation.
The Austrians contacted the FBI because they were trying to tap into our experience of dealing with serial homicide investigations. This was the first serial murder investigation in modern history in Austria.
Unbelievably, Unterweger wrote an article about the murders and advocated the use of brothels in Austria, even suggesting society should do more to help these girls. After all, the police had nothing to go on. They could not access the list of clients each girl had, and there was no witnesses to any of the deaths. But this killer would make his biggest mistake when he was given a working assignment in 1991 that would require him to take a trip to Los Angeles, where he would take full advantage of the situation.
Either Jack Unterweger was the unluckiest man in the world to have been there, or he was an excellent suspect.
When he arrived in Los Angeles, he checked into the infamous Cecil Hotel. It can be no coincidence he had chosen the same hotel famous for inhabiting one of America's worst killers, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. His main goal while there was to do research on his upcoming work, The Dark Side of Los Angeles. And to do this, he would need to hire the services of several escorts. Back in Austria, their first serial killer appears to have taken a break, and the case goes quiet. Strangely enough, this coincided with a series of new murders that would take place. Their location, Los Angeles. July 1991, and the first of 3 tragic deaths would occur, and they all matched the Austrian killing in every single way, all strangled with their own underwear, and all left in the hills of the city. But before he left for LA, Austrian authorities had begun watching Unterweger, and their suspicions were soon proved right. They then came to the shattering conclusion that the serial killer they were hunting had been writing newspaper articles about his own murders. Ready to return home, Unterweger checked out of the Cecil Hotel and actually managed to win over an employee, Bianca Mrak, who left with him. He returned to Austria with his new girlfriend, and the police swooped in on his Vienna address. But he was one step ahead and had already left. The hunt to find Jack Unterweger was on. It was during the time on the run that he actually called the Austrian media in an attempt to proclaim his innocence. He then led the authorities on a manhunt through Europe and Canada until he was finally apprehended in Miami in 1992, and the victims of these most brutal crimes would see justice served as Unterweger would face a judge in a trial that would send shockwaves around the world.
It was all over the newspapers, headlines. And when we came into this town to testify, it was a big deal. We were all over the front pages of the paper, the whole deal.
During the course of the trial, the prosecution would build a strong case against the accused, and eventually, he would be found guilty of 9 counts of murder. This would be seen as justice for the many victims of Jack Unterweger, but the killer himself had other ideas. He had control of his situation every step of the way, and now he was facing a life out of his control. It appears this was too much for him to live with, and while his prison guards weren't looking, he himself with the cord of his own prison jumpsuit.
We normally think of suicide as coming from depression or someone who feels shame or guilt or remorseful in some way. This is not at all what was going on when Jack committed suicide. More psychopathic offenders like Jack do it to exert control, and it's the last great defiant act that he exercised.
Ironically, he used the same knot on himself as the ones he had used on each of his victims. Although he escaped a lifetime of incarceration, many will seek justice served when he took his own life, ensuring he would never kill again. Finally, we look at perhaps the most unhinged individual today, who taunted police and would take 30 years to bring to justice.
There was standing room only today in the courtroom filled with April Tinsley's family, friends, supporters.
This is John Miller, and he is being led into court for a trial that caused a media storm, as this trial had been 30 years in the making, and this monster would face the hardest of justice. His crimes took place in 1988 and left a family and a nation in mourning. April 1st, 1988, and April Tinsley is playing with friends in her local neighborhood, but by 3 p.m., she was nowhere to be seen. When she didn't return to dinner, her mother called the police, and a large-scale search began to find the missing 8-year-old that included over 300 officers and volunteers. During the search, a witness reported seeing a man forcing a girl into his blue pickup truck around the time April was last seen. The frantic search continued, but on April 4th, the family received the most heartbreaking news. A jogger tragically found the body of missing April in a ditch, and she had been killed in the most brutal way. The autopsy later confirmed she had been strangled to death and had also been violated, and the hunt to find her sick and twisted killer was on. Police had also gained a second lead, another witness who had seen the blue pickup truck in the area. Outraged residents demanded answers, and local radio stations set up rewards for the capture of her killer. And it wasn't long before a suspect was named. The 34-year-old had been guilty of crimes against children in the past, but was not April's killer. In fact, April's family would not get any answers anytime soon, as their nightmare was only just beginning, as April's killer would begin taunting the police in a sick game of cat and mouse.
There's gotta be a bright spot. It's gonna come someday. And then there's moments you have like, this is never gonna be solved.
The notes and messages began only a year or so after the murder. First discovered was a message scribbled at a township barn, in which was written, "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley," and "Did you find the other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." The chilling messages would continue, but over 25 years later, as in 2004, a series of notes appeared around the town on Memorial Day. 3 were found on girls' bicycles and the last in a mailbox, and their contents will unnerve you. Each note contained the terrifying words of April's killer, and he sounded hungry to strike again as he wrote, "You are my next victim. If you don't report this to the police, and if I don't see this in the paper tomorrow or on the local news, I will blow up your house." Each note came concealed in a plastic bag, and the other contents are a view into the mind of a monster, as he also placed used contraception and photographs of his own partially body in each bag. But he made a grave mistake, and now police had vital DNA evidence that might help identify April's killer. After sending the sample to forensics for testing, the results came back. They narrowed it down to 2 brothers, and one of those was John Miller. And as investigators found out, he was well known to his neighbors.
I know he had a bad temper. He'd always be outside cussing and swearing, throwing stuff.
All they needed was to get a sample of DNA from the suspect himself.
Investigators later recovering a DNA sample from Miller's trash. That, they say, tied him to April's murder.
The DNA matched, and finally the police had enough to bring him in for questioning. It was reported that as soon as the police asked if he knew they were there, he instantly said it was because of April Tinsley. During his interrogation, he confessed to killing in every sickening detail.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers. And on Sunday, we were able to give them some of those answers.
He had snatched a terrified April from the street and taken her back to his trailer, where he committed the most brutal acts on this innocent girl. And now he would be made to answer for his crimes.
John D. Miller appeared in court today with his public defender alongside him.
The DNA is still going to be the most important piece of evidence in this case. You combine that with the confession, and it's hard to figure out exactly what his defense is going to be.
John D. Miller was sentenced to 80 years for the murder of April Tinsley, and at 59, he would likely spend the rest of his natural life in prison, where this barbaric killer deserves to be. Each of these cases have had their own share of tragedy and heartbreak. These killers showed no remorse in their actions, but even if it took decades to catch them, each one was brought to justice and made to pay for their crimes. Let me know what you think about these cases in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with the world's most brutal crimes.